The captain banished him off the deck. Then a SH-60 Seahawk landed against his orders. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The sun beat down harshly on the deck of the ship, casting a sharp glare across the metal surface as the crew moved about in their routine. But there was something different about the atmosphere today. The air was thick with tension, and as the young captain strutted across the deck, his eyes scanned the men working, dismissing their presence as if they were nothing more than pawns in his domain. Among them, however, was an old man. He stood quietly off to the side, his posture humble, yet unwavering. His name was Henry, a man whose age had weathered his body, but not his resolve. He had been here before. He had served this country, fought battles, and earned his place among the legends. But now, he was nothing more than a silent observer. The captain, a man fresh from officer school, with more arrogance than experience, saw him standing there and couldn't help but sneer. "You there!" The captain barked, striding over to Henry with the force of a storm. "What are you doing here? This is no place for civilians. Get off the deck before I have to make you." The young officer's tone dripped with disdain. Henry didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, not meeting the captain's gaze, but rather focusing on the distant horizon, as if searching for something only he could see. He had waited through worse. The captain continued, pressing his authority. "This is a restricted area. You don't belong here, old man." Henry's hand, calloused from years of hard work, rested lightly on the railing, his fingers curling around the cold metal. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but there was a weight to it, a presence that spoke of something far more than his weathered years. "I'm not leaving," he said simply. "I'm here for the captain. He would have wanted me here." The captain scoffed. "And who might you be to him? The man didn't know you. He had a life to live, real work to do, unlike you." The words cut through the air like a blade. The insult was thinly veiled with respect, but it was there, sharp and undeniable. As the captain turned to dismiss him, Henry's words stopped him cold. "My name is Henry. I'm the one who kept him alive when others gave up." The captain paused. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the old man before him, still not quite processing what he had just heard. "Oh sure. You and the captain. Best friends, I'm sure," the captain said with an eye roll. He turned to walk away, but his steps faltered as he noticed something gleaming in the sunlight on Henry's jacket. A pin, dull and weathered, was pinned to his lapel. It was small, a faint reminder of something long past, but to anyone who had been in the field, it meant everything. The captain leaned in, his face twisting with mockery as he reached out to flick the pin. As his finger brushed against the tarnished metal, the world seemed to shift. The ship deck faded into the background, and suddenly, Henry wasn't just an old man standing on a modern ship. He was back in the heat of battle, crouched in a jungle, the sounds of gunfire and the smell of burning wood filling the air. He saw his younger self, younger than anyone on this deck, crouched in a muddy trench, watching over his comrades as they fought tooth and nail for survival. The memories flooded back, flashes of faces, of lives lost and saved, of promises made in the heat of battle. "Keep this," a voice rasped, hands trembling from the weight of the moment. "You saved us, Henry. This is for you, so you never forget." The memory vanished as quickly as it had come. Henry blinked, and there he was again, standing on the deck, the captain still in front of him, unaware of the storm of memories that had just passed through him. Henry's gaze was different now, the quiet fire of a lifetime of service burning just beneath the surface. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them. His hand moved slowly, but with purpose, to gently push the captain's hand away from his pin. "Don't touch that," he said, his voice low, but now with an unmistakable weight of command. The captain, momentarily thrown off balance, stared at the old man in confusion. But before he could respond, a sudden roar of engines filled the air, and the unmistakable sound of helicopter blades cut through the tension. An SH-60 Seahawk, military-grade and menacing, appeared overhead, its silhouette unmistakable against the sky. It was moving fast, its landing gears locking into place as it came in for an unexpected landing, right on the deck. The ship came alive with movement, crew members scrambling to clear the space. The captain's confusion turned to alarm as the helicopter's doors opened, and a senior officer stepped out, his expression unreadable. Henry stood still, unfazed. The captain's eyes widened as the officer approached. With a slow, deliberate stride, the officer made his way toward Henry, his boots clicking against the deck with an unmistakable authority. The tension hung thick in the air. The captain stepped back, his heart pounding, as he realized something. Henry wasn't just an old man. He was someone who had earned the right to stand here. Someone whose presence commanded respect in ways that the captain could not yet understand. The helicopter blades sliced through the thick air, the sound deafening as the SH-60 Seahawk came to a sudden, but controlled, landing on the deck. The crew scrambled, their disciplined movements a stark contrast to the chaotic tension in the air. The captain stood frozen, his mind racing. What was happening? Who was this man, really? His eyes flicked between the helicopter and the figure of the old man, still standing calmly at the edge of the ship, the winds tugging at his worn jacket. The officers who had been standing near the helicopter were already moving towards him, their uniforms crisp, their steps precise. They looked at the captain with the kind of respect that could only come from someone who had been through it all. Henry remained still, but his presence seemed to fill the entire deck. The officer who stepped forward was no stranger to authority. His polished boots clicked against the metal floor as he approached Henry, his face a mask of professionalism. Sergeant Major Henry Carter, the officer said, his voice carrying across the deck. The captain's breath caught in his throat. The name hit him like a hammer. He had heard stories, whispers among the higher-ups, about a man by that name, a man whose reputation in the military was legendary. But to see him standing there, in front of him, was something entirely different. It's an honor, sir. The officer continued, his tone respectful, his salute sharp. We've been waiting for you. The captain's confusion deepened. Who was this man? And why had he been so insistent on staying? The officer turned, his gaze landing on the captain. Is there a problem, Captain? He asked, his tone now colder, more authoritative. The captain stammered, unsure of what to say. He had been in command of this deck, this ship, and yet somehow, this old man. This man who had stood silent through the mockery, the insults, and the chaos, held more weight than he could comprehend. No, sir. The captain finally managed to say, his voice strained. No problem at all. The officer nodded once, and then turned his attention back to Henry. Sir, if you would follow me, we have a few things to discuss, he said. Henry nodded quietly, the weight of the moment settling in. As he began to walk toward the helicopter, the crew parted to make way, their eyes following him with a mix of awe and curiosity. The captain stood rooted to the spot, his mind swirling with questions. He had underestimated this man. He had looked at him as just another old veteran, someone who had outlived his usefulness, someone who didn't belong on a military deck like this. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. Henry had never been just an old man. He was a living legend, and the respect he commanded was something that could not be ignored. As Henry reached the helicopter, the officer saluted again, and Henry returned it, his movements deliberate and respectful. The door to the helicopter opened, and the crew inside gave him a nod of acknowledgement, their expressions betraying none of the shock or awe that the captain had just felt. Henry climbed inside, the officer following closely behind. The helicopter doors closed, and for a moment, the deck was silent. The captain stood there, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. He had just witnessed the power of respect, earned not by titles or uniforms, but by deeds. The crew around him went about their business, but the atmosphere had changed. The captain could feel it in the air, in the way the men moved with a new sense of purpose. He had been given a lesson today, one that he would not soon forget. As the helicopter lifted off, the captain watched it disappear into the sky, the realization that he had just witnessed something extraordinary slowly settling in. He had banished Henry from the deck, thinking he was just another old man. But in reality, Henry had been the one in control all along. And now, the captain understood. The true power of a legend was not in the medals or the uniforms, but in the way it made others stand at attention, not out of fear, but out of respect. The helicopter blades sliced through the thick air, the sound deafening as the SH-60 Seahawk came to a sudden, but controlled, landing on the deck. The crew scrambled, their disciplined movements a stark contrast to the chaotic tension in the air. The captain stood frozen, his mind racing. What was happening? Who was this man, really? His eyes flicked between the helicopter and the figure of the old man, still standing calmly at the edge of the ship, the winds tugging at his worn jacket. The officers who had been standing near the helicopter were already moving towards him, their uniforms crisp, their steps precise. They looked at the captain with the kind of respect that could only come from someone who had been through it all. Henry remained still, but his presence seemed to fill the entire deck. The officer who stepped forward was no stranger to authority. His polished boots clicked against the metal floor as he approached Henry, his face a mask of professionalism. "Sergeant Major Henry Carter," the officer said, his voice carrying across the deck. The captain's breath caught in his throat. The name hit him like a hammer. He had heard stories, whispers among the higher-ups, about a man by that name, a man whose reputation in the military was legendary. But to see him standing there, in front of him, was something entirely different. "It's an honor, sir," the officer continued, his tone respectful, his salute sharp. "We've been waiting for you." The captain's confusion deepened. Who was this man? And why had he been so insistent on staying? The officer turned, his gaze landing on the captain. "Is there a problem, Captain?" he asked, his tone now colder, more authoritative. The captain stammered, unsure of what to say. He had been in command of this deck, this ship, and yet somehow, this old man. This man who had stood silent through the mockery, the insults, and the chaos, held more weight than he could comprehend. "No, sir," the captain finally managed to say, his voice strained. "No problem at all." The officer nodded once, and then turned his attention back to Henry. "Sir, if you would follow me, we have a few things to discuss," he said. Henry nodded quietly, the weight of the moment settling in. As he began to walk toward the helicopter, the crew parted to make way, their eyes following him with a mix of awe and curiosity. The captain stood rooted to the spot, his mind swirling with questions. He had underestimated this man. He had looked at him as just another old veteran, someone who had outlived his usefulness, someone who didn't belong on a military deck like this. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. Henry had never been just an old man. He was a living legend, and the respect he commanded was something that could not be ignored. As Henry reached the helicopter, the officer saluted again, and Henry returned it, his movements deliberate and respectful. The door to the helicopter opened, and the crew inside gave him a nod of acknowledgement, their expressions betraying none of the shock or awe that the captain had just felt. Henry climbed inside, the officer following closely behind. The helicopter doors closed, and for a moment, the deck was silent. The captain stood there, the weight of the situation slowly sinking in. He had no idea what was about to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. He had just witnessed the power of respect, earned not by titles or uniforms, but by deeds. The crew around him went about their business, but the atmosphere had changed. The captain could feel it in the air, in the way the men moved with a new sense of purpose. He had been given a lesson today, one that he would not soon forget. As the helicopter lifted off, the captain watched it disappear into the sky, the realization that he had just witnessed something extraordinary slowly settling in. He had banished Henry from the deck, thinking he was just another old man, but in reality, Henry had been the one in control all along. And now, the captain understood. The true power of a legend was not in the medals or the uniforms, but in the way it made others stand at attention, not out of fear, but out of respect. The helicopter soared higher into the sky, the wind howling as it left the ship behind. Inside, Henry sat in silence, his eyes steady as the scenery below became a blur of blue and white. The officer beside him, still clearly unsettled by the earlier encounter, shifted in his seat. His hands were clenched on his lap, as if he was still trying to process what had just happened. But Henry, calm as ever, wasn't interested in explanations. He had done his part. The rest was now in the hands of those who knew how to follow through. The officer glanced at him, his curiosity evident. "You don't talk much, do you, sir?" he asked, his voice low. Henry smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curling just enough to show a glimpse of his years of experience. Not much to say. I prefer to let actions speak for themselves. The officer nodded, though he seemed unsure of how to respond. We're headed to the base, the officer continued, trying to fill the silence. General Thompson wants to see you personally. He's been expecting you. Henry's eyes flickered slightly, but he said nothing. He had known this moment would come. It wasn't the first time he'd been called out of retirement. It wasn't even the first time he'd been summoned for something like this. But it was still the same as it always had been. Respect, recognition, and the undeniable weight of history. The officer continued speaking, explaining protocols, but Henry's mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the time when he had been a young man, full of fire and determination. The mission that had shaped his future, the one that had ultimately led to his quiet retirement, still haunted him in quiet moments. The sounds of distant gunfire, the smell of smoke and dust, the camaraderie of soldiers who had fought together and survived. He remembered the faces of those who had fallen, the ones who had died in his arms, the ones whose names he could never forget. He wasn't the same man who had been there on that battlefield, but the weight of those days still sat heavy on him. Henry snapped out of his thoughts when the officer spoke again, a little more urgently. Sir, we're approaching the base. You'll need to disembark soon. General Thompson is waiting. Henry nodded, his gaze shifting back to the officer. Lead the way. The helicopter began its descent, the city sprawling below, a reminder of the world that had continued to turn while he had stayed on the sidelines. As the helicopter touched down, the noise of the rotors cutting through the air once again, Henry's eyes were drawn to the figures waiting on the tarmac. It was a familiar sight, military men in impeccable uniforms, their expressions steely, their postures straight. But there was one figure who stood apart from the rest, General Thompson. The general's reputation was legendary, a man known for his calm, unwavering authority. But there was something more to him, something that Henry could read in the way the general stood, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes never left Henry as he disembarked. The officer beside him stepped forward, leading Henry toward the general. Sir, Sergeant Major Henry Carter, he said, his voice respectful. The general's face remained neutral, but as soon as his eyes locked onto Henry's, a flicker of something passed between them. Respect, understanding, a shared history that neither man needed to explain. The general took a step forward, his hand raised in a sharp salute. Sergeant Major Carter, he said, his voice low but powerful. It's an honor, sir. Henry returned the salute, his own expression unchanging, but a quiet respect in his eyes. The honor is mine, General. The general's eyes scanned Henry, taking in the man who had been a legend long before the younger officers had even thought about joining the military. You've been away for a long time, Sergeant Major. I was beginning to think we would never have the chance to meet, General Thompson said, his voice still carrying the weight of authority. I didn't expect to be called back, sir, Henry replied, his voice steady. But I understand why you've summoned me. The general nodded. We have a situation. A mission that requires your expertise. Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, his instincts kicking in. This was why he had been called back. What's the mission, sir? He asked, his tone sharp. The general hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to the officers around him. We're about to enter hostile territory. We need someone with experience to lead us. Henry's mind was already processing the details, running through the possibilities, but he didn't show it. I'm ready, sir, he said simply. The general's gaze softened, just slightly, as he gave a curt nod. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, Sergeant Major. I'm glad you're here. Henry's gaze met the general's, and for the first time since arriving, he allowed himself a small, approving nod. The general had made the right choice. He wasn't just an old veteran. He was a man who had seen the worst and survived it. And now, he was ready to face it once more. As they walked toward the base, the rest of the team falling into line behind them, Henry knew this would be no ordinary mission. He had been summoned for a reason, because they knew what he could do, and it was time to remind them all. The base was alive with activity as the team gathered in the command center, the hum of chatter and clattering keyboards filling the air. Henry stood at the edge of the room, his hands folded in front of him, watching the younger officers and soldiers rush around, preparing for the mission ahead. He had been in similar rooms before, surrounded by people who didn't fully understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another mission. It wasn't just another operation. This was personal. General Thompson stood at the front, his voice cutting through the noise as he outlined the plan. "We're entering a volatile area," he said, his tone firm. "We'll be facing enemy forces that have been entrenched for years. We need to move fast, and we need to move with precision." Henry's mind began to work in overdrive, processing the information. He had seen missions like this before, though the stakes were always high. But something about this mission felt different. The captain who had been so quick to dismiss him on the deck had no idea what was at stake. None of them did. The general glanced over at Henry, catching his eye. "Sergeant Major, we'll need your expertise on the ground," he said. "I trust you'll take charge once we're in position." Henry nodded, his expression unchanging. "Understood, sir," he replied. The general's gaze flickered with something resembling respect. "We'll be depending on you." Henry didn't say another word, but he knew what that meant. He had to keep them alive. That was the mission. No one else could do it. The rest of the team was briefed, each member taking their assigned positions. The atmosphere was tense, everyone aware that there was no room for error. As they made their way to the staging area, the helicopters were being prepared for takeoff. The noise of the engines revving up echoed across the base. Henry walked ahead of the team, his pace steady. He wasn't nervous. He had done this before, many times. But what he did feel was the weight of the lives that were about to depend on him. The younger soldiers and officers around him were still adjusting to the gravity of what lay ahead. They hadn't seen the horrors of war up close. They hadn't been through what he had. He caught sight of the captain from earlier, now in full combat gear, standing near the helicopter, looking at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The man hadn't said a word since the encounter on the deck, but Henry could feel the shift in how he was regarded. The dismissive attitude was gone, replaced by something more respectful. Henry stepped onto the helicopter first, followed by the general and the rest of the team. The door closed behind them, the noise of the engines filling the space as the helicopter lifted off the ground, rising higher into the sky. As they soared over the base, Henry's mind returned to the battlefield. He had been in this situation before, many years ago. He had seen men die for less, men who were just as young and full of hope as these soldiers around him. He couldn't let that happen again. Not on his watch. The flight was long, the landscape beneath them gradually changing from the familiar green fields of the base to the barren, rocky terrain of the enemy's stronghold. The helicopter began to descend, its rotors cutting through the air with a sharp, steady rhythm. Henry felt the familiar twinge in his chest as the chopper touched down. The sound of the rotor blades slowly fading as they came to a stop. The moment they hit the ground, the team moved swiftly into action, the sound of boots hitting the dirt and weapons being loaded into place. Henry's eyes scanned the area, his instincts kicking in. The mission was about to begin. He could feel the tension rising in the air, the silent understanding among the soldiers. They were ready. They had to be. The general nodded toward Henry. "You're in charge, Sergeant Major. Lead the way." Henry didn't hesitate. He moved forward, his steps steady and sure. "Move out," he ordered, his voice cutting through the air. The team followed his lead, moving in perfect formation, each member knowing their role. As they advanced toward the enemy lines, Henry's mind never wavered. He had done this before. He had faced down worse. The only thing that mattered now was the mission. The rest would fall into place. The quiet hum of the helicopter engines had faded, replaced by the sharp crack of distant gunfire. The team was closing in. The mission was about to take a dangerous turn, but Henry was ready. He had lived for this moment. And no matter what, he would make sure the mission succeeded. The team moved swiftly through the rocky terrain, their boots crunching softly against the dry earth as they advanced toward the enemy's position. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley, the sharp crack of weapons signaling that the conflict had already begun. Henry led the group, his movements calculated, his instincts guiding him every step of the way. The general walked beside him, a silent partner, his face hard and determined, but there was no mistaking the respect in his eyes. The soldiers behind them followed in perfect formation, but it was clear that the weight of the mission hung heavily on all of them. They knew what was at stake. They had seen the briefings, heard the intel. This wasn't just a tactical strike. This was a fight for survival. Henry's mind was sharp, as it always was in moments like this. He could feel the pulse of the mission, the rhythm of the battlefield, and he trusted his men. He trusted himself. But even as he moved, his mind was focused on one thing, the call sign. He hadn't forgotten it. The general had said he was ready. The truth, however, was that Henry had spent years in silence, away from the front lines, away from the action. His name had become a whisper in the dark corners of military history, a memory to be honored but not fully understood. And yet, here he was, leading a team into a mission that would define the next chapter of his life. They came to a ridge overlooking the enemy camp. The layout was familiar: sandbag bunkers, fortified positions, and scattered patrols. It was a tactical nightmare, the kind of operation Henry had faced time and time again. But this was different. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a test of everything he had learned. The general moved beside him, surveying the enemy position. "We'll need to split into 2 teams," he said, his voice low. "One will create a distraction, the other will move in from the east. We'll have to be fast. The element of surprise is our best weapon." Henry nodded. "We'll cover the eastern flank," he said, his voice steady. "Make sure your men are ready." The general's gaze hardened, and he turned to speak with his officers. Henry felt the tension rise as the soldiers moved into position. There was no room for error here. He knew that. He also knew what was coming. As the team moved into place, Henry's mind drifted back to his days in the field. The smell of sweat and gunpowder, the sound of helicopters overhead, the feel of a rifle in his hands. The feeling of being alive in the middle of chaos. It was an addiction, a hunger that he could never shake. But now it wasn't about him. It was about the mission, and about the men he had promised to lead. The order was given, and the team began to move. The first team took off, creating a loud distraction on the western edge of the camp, drawing the attention of the enemy forces. Henry's team, now concealed in the shadows of the ridge, began their advance. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The enemy wasn't expecting them. They wouldn't know what hit them until it was too late. They moved quickly but quietly, staying in cover as much as possible, each man aware of the risks. As they neared the enemy's first line of defense, Henry signaled for them to stop. They were close now. Too close. He could feel his pulse quicken. The adrenaline was building, and his mind raced through the sequence of events. There would be no turning back after this. As he peered through his scope, his eyes locked onto a figure moving inside the bunker. It was a high-ranking officer, likely the one pulling the strings behind the operation. This was the target. He was the key to breaking the enemy's resolve. Henry took a deep breath, his finger lightly resting on the trigger. The world seemed to slow around him. The sights were aligned, the target in his crosshairs. But just before he could take the shot, a shout came from behind him. "Sergeant Major!" It was the general's voice, sharp and urgent. Henry's eyes snapped away from the target, his focus now on the general, who was motioning for him to pull back. Henry felt a momentary surge of frustration. The shot was perfect. The target was vulnerable. But he understood. This wasn't about one shot. This was about the entire mission. With a final glance at the target, Henry lowered his rifle and signaled for the team to move. They would strike from a different angle. The general's plan was still in motion. The team moved again, shifting into position. But as they made their way forward, the enemy was quick to react. The sounds of gunfire erupted from the camp, followed by the thundering roar of explosions. The battle had officially begun, and it was chaos. Henry's team fought their way through the first line of defenses, taking out the enemy one position at a time. The gunfire was relentless, but they pushed forward. Henry's instincts were in full gear now. Every movement, every decision, was made in an instant. They reached the final bunker, where the enemy was making their last stand. Henry's heart raced as he approached, his rifle at the ready. The general's voice came through the comms. "This is it, Sergeant Major. Finish it." Henry didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he burst through the door, and the fight was on. Bullets flew past him as he took cover behind a concrete pillar. The enemy was dug in, but Henry knew exactly what to do. With a steady hand, he dropped to one knee, aimed, and fired. The enemy officer fell, and the camp fell silent. It was over. They had won. Henry exhaled, the tension leaving his body. The mission had been a success. As he looked around at the team, he could see the relief on their faces. But Henry's mind was already moving to the next challenge. There was always a next challenge. The general approached, his face unreadable. You did it, Sergeant Major, he said, his voice carrying the weight of respect. Henry gave a simple nod. It's what I do. The mission had been completed, but the adrenaline still coursed through Henry's veins. His hands, though steady in the field, now felt the weight of the moment. As he and the rest of the team made their way back to base, the battlefield had already begun to clear. The enemy forces had fallen back, and the area was now secured. The sound of helicopters whirring in the distance, soldiers securing the area, and the faint chatter of radios in the air told Henry that their work was far from done. But for now, they could breathe. As the team returned to the base, the familiar sight of the command center loomed ahead. Soldiers were already moving in and out, reporting updates, and giving their debriefs. General Thompson met Henry at the entrance, his face hard but respectful. Mission accomplished, Sergeant Major. We couldn't have done it without you. Henry gave a small nod, acknowledging the compliment without needing to say much. He had been part of many operations before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the respect he had gained from the younger officers, or the sense of purpose that had come with leading a team once again. We still have a long way to go, Henry replied. The real work starts now. General Thompson looked at him for a moment, understanding in his eyes. You're right. The mission might be over, but the aftermath is just as crucial. We need to make sure the area is stable, and we'll be coordinating with local forces to hold our ground. Henry turned to face the command center, where officers and soldiers were already discussing the next steps. What's the next move? He asked. The general looked to his officers before responding. We'll be taking stock of the damage, making sure the enemy doesn't regroup. There's a lot of intel to sift through, and we'll need to set up a defense perimeter around the area. We're not out of the woods yet. As the team began to disperse, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of everything. He had led the charge, but it wasn't just his victory. It was the victory of every soldier who had fought beside him. Every person in that room had a hand in the success, but Henry's presence had been the catalyst. It wasn't just his skills that had made the difference. It was his experience, his unwavering resolve, and the lessons of war that had shaped him into the leader he had become. Henry had seen it all, the horrors, the losses, the sacrifice. And now, he was back to finish what he had started. As the soldiers began to move out again, Henry found himself walking alone for a moment. The weight of leadership, of making life-and-death decisions, was never light. But it was a burden he had carried for a long time. He didn't feel the need for praise. It wasn't about recognition. It was about the mission and the men who depended on him. He could already see the next step, the next move. But even as he walked, he couldn't shake the memory of that moment when he had been dismissed by the captain on the deck. It had been a long time since anyone had underestimated him. And that's what had made this mission so satisfying. Not just the success, but the reminder that experience and wisdom were invaluable. Henry had proven that he still had what it took. He wasn't just an old man in a uniform. He was a legend, one whose story wasn't finished. As he returned to the command center, he was greeted by a familiar face, Captain Hayes, a young officer who had been part of the operation from the beginning. Sergeant Major, Hayes said, his voice hesitant but full of respect. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Henry looked at him, his expression softening. You did good, Hayes, he replied. We all did. But remember, the work's never done. Hayes nodded, clearly understanding what Henry meant. It wasn't just about one battle or one victory. It was about the constant fight, the never-ending work to protect and serve. Understood, sir. The captain's words were sincere, and for the first time since their initial encounter, Henry saw something different in the young officer. It wasn't just respect, it was admiration. And that meant more to Henry than any medal or recognition ever could. As the debriefing continued, Henry remained in the background, observing quietly. His role was no longer to be in the spotlight. He had already done what he needed to do. The next generation would carry the torch forward. But for now, Henry was content in knowing that he had helped secure a future for them, and for everyone they swore to protect. The mission was over, but the legacy of what they had done would live on. The days following the mission were a blur of reports, debriefings, and quiet reflections. The base had settled into a routine, but the energy was different. It was a strange kind of calm, the kind that only comes after the storm has passed and the dust has settled. Henry spent most of his time in the command center, reviewing the intelligence they had gathered during the operation. His mind was still sharp, even in the quiet aftermath. His reputation as a military legend had only grown stronger after the mission, but Henry wasn't interested in the accolades. He wasn't interested in being remembered. He was here for one thing, duty. The general had already moved on to the next operation, as he always did. But he hadn't forgotten about Henry. He had become a fixture in the planning sessions, offering advice when needed, his experience proving invaluable. Henry wasn't a man who liked to be in the spotlight, but he was a man who knew how to get things done. And right now, his mind was focused on what came next. The team had done their part, and now the focus was shifting to rebuilding, to making sure the area remained stable. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Captain Hayes. "Sergeant Major," Hayes said, his voice respectful as always. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Henry looked up from his desk, his eyes meeting the young captain's. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Hayes stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. There was a seriousness in his posture, a sense of urgency that Henry had come to recognize. "I've been thinking," Hayes began, "about the operation. About how it went down. I wanted to know what made you do it." Henry raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The decision," Hayes said, his voice lowering slightly. "When we were on the ridge. You didn't take the shot when you had the perfect opportunity." "What?" Henry sat back in his chair, considering the question. It was a good one. The captain was sharp. "Because there's more to a mission than just completing the objective," Henry replied. "It's about the bigger picture. Taking a shot might have solved the immediate problem, but it wouldn't have solved the larger issue. The mission wasn't just about killing the target. It was about making sure the team came home. It was about making sure we didn't lose focus." Hayes nodded, absorbing the lesson. Henry could see the respect in his eyes, the understanding that was beginning to form. "I've been watching you, Sergeant Major," Hayes said, his tone changing slightly. "The way you operate. You don't just lead, you guide. You make decisions that keep people alive. I want to learn that. I want to learn how to be like you." Henry studied the young captain for a moment. He saw the drive, the ambition, the hunger, but he also saw the naivety. Hayes had the potential, but he still had a lot to learn. "It's not about being like me," Henry said softly. "It's about understanding the responsibility that comes with leadership. It's about making the tough choices, the ones that others won't. It's about protecting your team, no matter the cost." Hayes stood there, silent for a moment, his mind clearly processing the weight of Henry's words. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," he said finally. "I'll remember that." "Good," Henry replied. "Now get out of here. You've got a job to do." Hayes smiled, a rare, genuine smile, and nodded. "Yes, sir." As the captain left the room, Henry leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep sigh. There was something about this mission, something about the way it had unfolded, that felt different. Maybe it was the respect he had earned from the younger officers, or maybe it was the realization that he was no longer just a relic of the past. He had made a difference, and that was enough. Henry's thoughts drifted again, this time to the quiet life he had tried to lead after leaving the military. It was easy to forget what he was capable of when he wasn't in the field, when he wasn't surrounded by the chaos of war. But the truth was, he could never forget. He had been shaped by the things he had done, the choices he had made. And as much as he had wanted to leave it all behind, he knew deep down that he was never truly done. The world needed men like him, men who had seen the worst and survived, men who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. He could walk away, but the mission would always be there. And when the call came again, Henry would answer it. He always had, and he always would. The weeks following the mission passed quickly, but for Henry, time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The camp was quieter now, the tension of the operation replaced by a low hum of routine. Soldiers were in and out, supplies were organized, and briefings were held daily. Life, in a way, had returned to normal, but there was something in the air that kept Henry on edge. It wasn't the mission itself that weighed on him. It was the feeling that something bigger was coming. General Thompson had been busy coordinating the aftermath of their operation. The area was secure, but there were still lingering threats in the surrounding regions. There was always something more to be done. Henry could feel the restlessness in the men around him, the hunger for action that never seemed to go away. They were soldiers, after all. They lived for it. As Henry sat alone in his quarters, his mind drifted back to that moment when the general had looked at him with respect, that moment when everything had changed. He had spent so many years in the shadows, fighting battles that no one would ever know about. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like his presence mattered. He had earned his place. And yet, something gnawed at him. Was this it? Was this all he had left to give? He had lived through so much, led so many, and had seen the worst of humanity. But now, as the world seemed to quiet down, he wondered if his days of action were behind him. The door to his quarters opened, and Captain Hayes stepped in, his expression serious. "Sergeant Major," Hayes began, his voice carrying a weight that immediately caught Henry's attention. "We've got something. The general needs to see you." Henry stood up, his instincts kicking in. Something was off. "What's going on?" he asked. Hayes hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's been movement. A group of insurgents has been spotted in the area. They're more organized than we thought, and they're getting closer. The general wants you with us for this one. It's going to be different." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment would come. It always did. There was no escaping it. "All right," Henry said, his voice steady. "Let's move out." They made their way to the command center, where the general was already briefing the team. The room was filled with officers and soldiers, all of them focused, their eyes locked on the maps spread out on the table. The general looked up as Henry entered, his gaze hard and calculating. "Sergeant Major," he greeted him with a nod. "Glad you could join us. We have a problem." The general gestured to the map. "This group of insurgents is unlike the others we've dealt with. They've been hitting our supply lines, and they're moving fast. We think they're planning something bigger. I want you to lead a team to intercept them." Henry studied the map, his mind already working through the logistics of the operation. "We'll need to move quickly. No time to waste," he said. "Exactly," the general agreed. "This isn't going to be easy. They're well armed, and they know the terrain better than we do. We need to be on top of this." Henry felt the familiar stirrings of focus, his mind sharpening as the mission came into focus. This was what he was made for. This was his purpose. He turned to the team, his voice steady but commanding. "Get your gear. We move out in 15 minutes. We hit them fast, and we hit them hard. Stay sharp, stay focused, and keep your eyes open. This won't be like the last operation. This is something else." The team nodded, their expressions serious. As the soldiers gathered their equipment and prepared for the mission, Henry's thoughts briefly returned to the past. He had led many teams, many missions, and had seen countless battles. But this one felt different. It wasn't just about the enemy. It was about the survival of everything they had worked for. The insurgents weren't just a threat to the base. They were a threat to the very stability of the region. As Henry gathered his own gear, he felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. This was what it meant to lead, to make decisions that would affect the lives of everyone around him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was the one who would determine the outcome. With his gear secured and his team in position, they made their way out of the base and into the night. The air was cold, and the landscape stretched out before them, dark and quiet. They moved quickly, covering ground as silently as possible. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the dirt and the occasional crackle of their radios. As they neared the enemy's last known location, Henry's mind raced through the tactics they would need. He had learned long ago that no plan ever survived contact with the enemy. But that didn't mean they wouldn't be ready. They would be. The team moved in, taking up positions on the perimeter of the enemy camp. Henry signaled for the team to hold their ground while he advanced. The air was thick with tension. Every soldier knew what was at stake. They were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting for control. The moment was coming. Henry could feel it in his bones. This was the final test, and he would see it through. As the mission unfolded, he would lead his team with everything he had. There was no turning back now. This was the fight they had been training for. The mission had escalated faster than Henry had anticipated. The team was now entrenched on the outskirts of the enemy's camp, the sound of distant gunfire filling the air, the night thick with the promise of imminent combat. It had been a calculated move to infiltrate from the east, but the enemy had already adapted to their strategy. The initial silence before the storm had dissipated, replaced by the chaos of gunfire and the sharp crackle of radios. Henry's mind was locked into the rhythm of battle, his instincts guiding him as he watched the team advance, moving with precision and caution. The insurgents had been cornered, but they were far from defeated. Henry signaled for the team to stay low, the weight of the moment settling over them. This wasn't just about engagement. It was about eliminating a threat that could destabilize everything they had fought for. The plan had been to strike quickly, to disrupt the enemy's lines before they could form any counteraction. But now, as the battle intensified, it was clear that the insurgents were better organized than expected. They had taken up defensive positions, their weapons trained on every possible entry point. Henry could feel the tension in the air, each step taken under the cover of darkness a risk. The captain, Hayes, was close behind him, his eyes scanning the area. Henry noticed the hesitation in the younger man's stance, a flicker of uncertainty that was hard to miss. Hayes had the skills, the discipline, but he lacked the one thing that came with time: experience. "Stay sharp," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the firefight. "Move when I move. We're close." Hayes nodded, his hand tightening on his rifle, but Henry could see the unease. The captain wasn't a fool, but this was his first real test, and Henry knew the weight of that moment would shape him forever. As they advanced, the noise of the firefight grew louder, the insurgents aware of their presence now. The first wave of gunfire erupted, and the team split into two, covering different angles. Henry was in the lead, instinctively moving toward the center of the camp. His mind moved faster than his feet, calculating each move, each shot. They had to neutralize the threat, but they couldn't afford to lose a single man in the process. "Watch your corners," Henry barked, his voice low but firm. The soldiers around him reacted swiftly, each member of the team falling into line, their movements synchronized. Henry's eyes darted across the camp, searching for the next move. He knew where the insurgents would be focused, the eastern perimeter, where the majority of his team was currently engaging. They had a few minutes at best before the enemy realized their position and began to fortify. Henry's instincts told him the insurgents were running low on supplies. They had to be. That would give his team the advantage. He signaled to Hayes, who was in the rear, to move up and take the flank with him. The young captain nodded, but Henry could see the strain in his expression. "We're good," Henry said quietly, knowing that Hayes needed reassurance. The captain had potential, but it would take time to see if he could handle the responsibility of leadership under fire. The team moved again, cutting across the open ground with tactical precision, a few low, controlled bursts of gunfire as cover. The closer they got to the enemy's command post, the more they encountered resistance. The insurgents were holding their ground, but Henry could see cracks forming in their defense. They were losing their grip. The insurgent leader, a man Henry had learned to fear through intel reports, had set up in the center of the camp, and he was their primary target. Henry's team wasn't just fighting for victory. They were fighting to neutralize the key players and prevent further attacks in the region. They couldn't afford to let this group regroup or escape. As they neared the command center, a heavy burst of fire erupted from a nearby bunker. Henry's team dropped to the ground instinctively, taking cover behind the scattered crates and rocks. The enemy was entrenched, but they had no idea that Henry had already anticipated their next move. He moved quickly, gesturing for his team to flank the bunker from the left, a maneuver that would force the insurgents to expose themselves. The plan worked. The gunfire from the bunker paused, giving Henry's team a chance to advance. He moved forward with precision, his rifle raised, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The moment felt like an eternity. Then, with a sharp nod to Hayes, they charged. The enemy didn't see it coming. A quick exchange of gunfire, and the bunker was cleared. Henry's team had broken through, but the fight wasn't over. The insurgent leader was still holed up in the central command post, waiting for backup that would never come. Henry made eye contact with Hayes. "It was time. Let's end this," he said, his voice steady. The two of them moved swiftly toward the final objective, weapons at the ready, knowing that this was the last push. As they entered the command post, the insurgent leader stood up from behind a desk, his face hard but nervous. He knew the battle was lost. Henry's team had done their job. The insurgent leader looked at them, his hands raised in surrender. "You've won," he spat, his voice thick with defeat. Henry stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is over," he said quietly, his hand gripping the rifle tighter. "And it's over for you." The insurgent leader didn't speak again. With one swift motion, the mission was complete. The camp was cleared, the insurgent leader neutralized, and the base was secure. Henry stood over the camp, watching as the soldiers moved in to secure the area. They had done their job, and Henry knew that this would be the last operation like this for him. His time in the field was coming to an end. But for now, there was peace. At least, for a little while. The aftermath of the mission was a strange mix of relief and quiet reflection. Henry stood at the edge of the base, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The day had been long, filled with debriefings and the task of securing the area. The team had done their part. The insurgents were gone, their leader taken out, and for the moment, the region was safe. But the peace felt temporary, fragile even. Henry knew that the nature of their work meant the calm would never last long. The rest of the team had moved on, the younger officers focusing on the next steps, ensuring their positions were solid, making plans for future operations. General Thompson had already started drafting a report for higher command, outlining the success of the mission and the immediate steps that would follow. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was no fanfare after the mission was over. There was no grand celebration. It was simply another day in the life of a soldier. The work was never truly done. As Henry walked through the camp, he noticed the faces of his men. They were tired, but they had done their jobs, and they knew the price of their victories. They had all seen the same thing, lived through the same hardships. The young soldiers might have thought they understood, but they didn't yet know the cost of battle, the true toll it took on a person. They hadn't lived through it long enough. Henry had lived through it all. The quiet moments, the long days of waiting, the endless miles, and then the chaos of battle. His experience was his weapon, honed over years of combat, but it was also a heavy burden to carry. He had given so much, and there was still more to give. But at what cost? As he moved back toward the command center, Henry noticed Captain Hayes standing off to the side, watching the camp, his eyes scanning the area. He looked deep in thought, a far cry from the unsure young officer who had followed Henry into battle not long ago. Hayes had come a long way, and Henry could see that in the way he carried himself now. There was confidence in his stance, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. The captain looked up as Henry approached, his face breaking into a small, respectful smile. "Sergeant Major," Hayes said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Good work today." Henry returned the nod. "You did well, Captain. Better than I expected." Hayes chuckled softly, the tension from earlier in the mission finally dissipating. "I learned from the best." There was a quiet pause between them, an unspoken recognition of the bond that had formed during the mission. Henry's experience had guided them through, but it was the trust they had built that had made the difference. "You're ready, Hayes," Henry said, his voice low but firm. "You've earned it. The next time, you lead. I'll be watching, but it's your turn now." Hayes looked surprised, but the pride in his eyes was evident. "I'm not sure I'm ready," he said quietly. "You are," Henry replied simply. "Leadership isn't about being ready. It's about stepping up when the time comes, even when you don't feel ready. You've done that." Hayes paused for a moment, absorbing the words. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Henry nodded. "Don't thank me yet. You've got work to do. Just remember what you've learned, and keep pushing forward." With that, Hayes turned and walked back toward the rest of the team, his steps more purposeful now. Henry watched him for a moment before turning to leave. He had done his part. The next generation was ready to take over. But Henry wasn't done yet. He wasn't sure when it would happen, but he knew there would come a time when he would be called again. And when that time came, he would be ready. For now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The mission had been a success, but the work never ended. It was a cycle, one that repeated itself as long as there were threats to face, battles to fight, and lives to protect. And Henry would be there, waiting, leading when the time came. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, and the darkness was settling in, but Henry wasn't afraid of the night. He had seen much darker days. The night was simply another part of the journey, and as the camp began to quiet, Henry knew that he was exactly where he needed to be, even if that meant more battles, more missions, more sacrifices. Because in the end, that was the life he had chosen, and he would live it to the fullest, no matter the cost. Weeks passed, and the base returned to its usual rhythm, but for Henry, there was a gnawing feeling that wouldn't leave him. The sense of peace that had settled over the camp seemed temporary, as it always did after an operation. The soldiers had done their part, the general had praised them, and life had moved on, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He sat alone in his quarters one evening, his mind drifting over the events of the past few weeks. He thought of Captain Hayes, who had grown more confident in the aftermath of the mission. Henry had seen it, the quiet transformation in the young officer. The seeds of leadership had been planted, and they had taken root. Hayes was ready for the next step, and Henry had no doubt he would take the lead when the time came. Yet, despite the progress and the quiet comfort of seeing a new generation of soldiers rise to the challenge, Henry felt the weight of his own years pressing down on him. The missions, the victories, the losses, they all began to blend together. It wasn't that he had grown tired. He still had the fire, the focus, the instincts that had carried him through countless battles. But there was an undeniable truth. He was no longer the man he had once been. His body had grown older, and while his mind was as sharp as ever, there was a part of him that longed for peace, for the kind of quiet that could only be found when the fight was over. As Henry sat in the solitude of his quarters, he couldn't help but wonder if this moment, this quiet, fleeting peace, was the calm before the storm. The military had a way of finding its veterans, and he knew that sooner or later, the call would come again. He just wasn't sure when. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. He stood, moved toward the door, and opened it to find General Thompson standing there. "Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice calm but serious. "We need to talk." Henry stepped aside to let him in. The general looked worn, as if the weight of command was beginning to show on him. Henry gestured to the chair across from him. "Take a seat, General. What's on your mind?" Thompson sat down, his eyes meeting Henry's with a mix of respect and something else, a sense of urgency. "We've received new intel. There's been a change in the situation. A bigger threat is emerging, and we need to act quickly." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming. The fight was never truly over. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice steady. The general leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "It's a coalition of forces. We've been tracking them for weeks. They've been working in the shadows, and now they're making their move. They're planning something big, something that could destabilize the entire region. We don't know everything yet, but it's clear we need to stop them before they strike." Henry's mind was already processing the information. He had been in this situation before, tracking down a shadow enemy, fighting a war that wasn't just about physical battles, but about strategy, deception, and patience. "What do you need from me?" Henry asked. The general looked at him, his expression hardening. "I need you to lead a team. You're the only one with the experience to handle this. We're going to hit them before they hit us. It's going to be dangerous." Henry's eyes narrowed, and he stood, moving toward the map that lay open on the table. The general had already marked the area where the enemy was most likely to strike. Henry studied it for a moment, his mind clicking into action. "You're right," he said, his voice now full of resolve. "This is it. We need to move fast. We'll hit them hard, disrupt their plans, and then we'll find out everything we can about their network." The general nodded. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand." Henry felt the weight of the responsibility settle over him. This mission was bigger than anything they had done before. It wasn't just about stopping an insurgent group. It was about preventing a full-scale collapse. This was the kind of mission that would define the future. Henry turned back to the general, his mind already working through the details. "We'll need to coordinate with local forces," he said. "They'll know the terrain better than anyone. We'll need intel on their movements and as much information as we can get on their leadership. Without that, we're flying blind." The general agreed. "I'll get our intelligence team on it. We'll also need air support. The insurgents are well equipped. This won't be a simple raid." Henry nodded. "I'll assemble the team. We'll move quickly." As the general stood to leave, Henry's thoughts were already focused on the next step. The plan, the execution, the men he would need to lead. This was what he had been waiting for, even if he hadn't realized it. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the door closed behind the general, Henry stood in the quiet of his room, feeling the weight of the mission settling in. This would be his final challenge. The world needed to be saved from this new threat, and Henry was ready. He had always been ready. The time for peace would come, but it wasn't now. And when the time came for action, Henry Carter would lead. That was his purpose, his duty, and he would never back down. The night before the mission, Henry stood at the edge of the base, watching the horizon as the last of the daylight faded. The camp was quiet now, with only the soft sounds of distant chatter and the occasional hum of machinery breaking the stillness. The soldiers were ready. They had trained for this, and now it was time to act. But for Henry, the weight of the mission was more than just the operation itself. It was about what came after. He had led men through countless battles, each one leaving its mark on him. But this mission felt different. It was the final one. He had known that it would come to this. The sense of peace he had longed for would have to wait. There was still work to be done, and it was up to him to make sure it got done. The general had already briefed him on the final details. It was a high-risk operation, one that would require all of Henry's experience and leadership to pull off. They were facing a highly organized group, one that had managed to evade detection for far too long. This was more than just a battle. It was about stopping a threat that could destabilize the region. Henry knew the stakes. The lives of the soldiers depended on how well they executed the plan. As he prepared his gear, he thought back to everything that had brought him to this moment. From the quiet days of training to the chaos of battle, he had lived through it all. The years had taken their toll, but he was still standing, still here, ready to fight. The next morning, as the team assembled in the briefing room, Henry looked around at the faces of the young soldiers. They were ready, but he could see the nervousness in their eyes. They hadn't seen what he had seen. They hadn't faced the same challenges. But that was the job now, to guide them, to lead them through the hardest fight of their lives. As they loaded into the helicopters and began their journey to the operation zone, Henry's mind remained sharp. He knew the risks, but he had made a promise to himself and to those he led that he would do everything in his power to keep them safe. The helicopters cut through the early morning mist, the sound of their engines loud in the quiet sky. Henry's heart beat steady in his chest, his thoughts focused on the mission ahead. He could feel the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. As the team dropped onto the ground felt solid beneath his boots. The enemy was close. They had to move quickly. Henry signaled for the team to stay low, the tension in the air palpable as they crept through the brush toward their target. The plan was simple: strike hard, fast, and with precision. There would be no room for error. The team split into two groups, one taking the left flank and the other covering the right. Henry stayed in the center, his eyes scanning the area. The enemy wasn't expecting them. They had no idea what was coming. As they moved deeper into the camp, the first shots were fired. The enemy had noticed them, and they were already responding. The firefight erupted, the crack of gunfire filling the air as Henry's team engaged. He moved quickly, directing his men, ensuring they were all in position. His instincts were on overdrive, each decision made in an instant, his focus never wavering. The team fought their way through, taking out enemy combatants as they moved. Henry's rifle never stopped, each shot aimed with deadly precision. His team was with him, each soldier moving like clockwork, executing their roles without hesitation. As they reached the enemy's command center, Henry knew they were close to the end. The insurgent leader was still inside, and he was their target. Henry's heart beat a little faster now. This was the moment. He signaled for the team to surround the building, then moved to the front. He could feel the presence of the enemy inside, waiting. Henry's hand tightened on his rifle. It was time to finish this. With a single command, they stormed the building. The doors were kicked in, and Henry's team rushed inside, guns raised, scanning the area for threats. The insurgent leader was there, his face hard, his eyes filled with defiance. But Henry knew there was no escape for him now. The battle was over. Henry's team moved swiftly, taking down any remaining resistance. The insurgent leader surrendered, his eyes betraying a mixture of anger and defeat. Henry stood over him, his rifle still aimed at the man. "It's over," Henry said, his voice steady. The insurgent leader looked up, his chest heaving with frustration. "You've won," he spat. "But this war is far from over." Henry didn't flinch. He had heard these words before, but they meant nothing now. "Not for you," Henry replied, his voice unwavering. The operation was a success. The insurgent group was neutralized, and the region was secure, for now. As Henry and his team returned to base, there was no celebration. There was no cheering. Just the quiet, solemn recognition that the job had been done. They had completed the mission, but there was always another to follow. The cycle of war, of duty, would never end. As Henry sat in his quarters later that evening, The weight of the mission finally began to settle in. He had led his men once again, and they had followed him without question. The mission had been a success, but the cost of war was never far from his mind. He had done his duty, and for now, that was enough. The quiet peace he had longed for was still out of reach, but Henry knew he could find it in his own time. For now, there was only the next mission, the next challenge, and Henry would be ready.